Well, thank you for that. Oh, does someone have their speaker on or something?
Me, but I'll.
Oh, cool. Okay, let's see that. All right, great. I can turn myself. Hi everyone. Thank you so much for having us. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen, but especially since it's a small group, please feel free to jump in with questions or if there's like a section, especially once we start going through that people are like, really, we want to just like spend some time talking about this. We kind of did this presentation as like a pretty broad overview of our work and then like ways for people to take action and those kind of different like ways that we make change. So like, please, yeah, feel free to redirect a little bit. Okay. Do slideshow. Cool. So yeah, Monica and I can just introduce ourselves really quick. My name is Grace, a she, her pronouns. I'm the advocacy and engagement manager at Gender Justice. Then I've been with Gender Justice since like 2019.
Hi, I'm Monica Meyer, and I live in Northeast Minneapolis. I use she and they pronouns, and I've been with Gender Justice as the political director for 2 years. In my background, I was out front Minnesota for 20 years, and I worked on LGBTQ equity, and I'm excited to be able to have a broader, just broader work that I get to do around bodily autonomy and gender equity. So I've been really excited to be at Gender Justice, and also um, have been really excited always that I've been able to partner with you all on a number of different issues when I was at Out Front and now at Gender Justice. And so thank you for all your work.
So just like quickly what we're planning to talk about. So first we're going to just say a little bit about gender justice, talk about our work in the courts, our like policy advocacy, a little bit about the state and federal landscape on gender equity, the impact of media and storytelling, and kind of just end with making some action plans to make change in your community. So it's just a little bit about gender justice. We're a nonprofit, we're based in St. Paul, but we work throughout the state and also in North Dakota. And we do legal and policy advocacy, as well as like public education and coalition building to advance gender equity. We take a movement-based approach, we take an intersectional approach. We know the law alone isn't enough. We're brave, we seek solutions outside of the criminal legal system, and we pursue nimble and adaptive approaches. These are kind of just some of our, I mentioned most of these already, but like core tactics. So we do, neither Monica and I do the lawyering, but we have people who are very good at that, who do that. And then our team is really focused on the like policy advocacy and like narrative change and yeah, public education. We're also the institutional home of Unrestricted Minnesota, which works to protect, expand, and destigmatize abortion access, and all reproductive health care in Minnesota. So there's kind of an unrestricted campaign and then a coalition of organizations that like come together to work on abortion access and reproductive health care access. And that work, we try to have it rooted in reproductive justice, which is an organizing framework created by Black women, where every person has the ability to decide if, when, and how to become a parent, raise healthy children in safe and thriving communities, and have gender freedom and bodily autonomy. And Monica, feel free to jump in on this, but the reason I wanted to throw this in here is because I think it really informs the like breadth of our work. So like, you know, we're not just doing LGBTQ issues, we're not just doing abortion care, but really trying to see gender equity like more holistically to make sure people can like live the lives that that they want to. Monica, is there anything that you want to say about like our work or our mission or how we do our work?
Well, I just think that when I think about the challenges we have today in front of us, um, I just really appreciate that we're working with partners like you all to just be bold and to work for the change we want to see, knowing that we have a lot of challenges right now. And so I think that the way, as much as we can be intersectional in our approach of thinking about like, how do we make Minnesota um, a place where all people can thrive? What are some of the challenges we're facing? How do we organize for the change we want to see? The better. So I really appreciate the intersectional lens that gender justice has in doing this work. And I think the other thing that's interesting is always to listen to all of you and other people that we work with about like just what ideas you have about how to make that actually a reality. And so that's what today's about.
Oh, this is just, I forgot I put this in here. This is just a little bit about, kind of post Roe, what unrestricted Minnesota's goals are, which were to repeal the restrictions, which we pretty much did. Enact protections, which Minnesota, will go into this a little bit later, but Minnesota has really good protections, and now really it's focused on ensuring that abortion access is like actually available in people's communities and affordable, which that is the one area where we are not there yet as a state. So yeah, that's just a little bit more about unrestricted. I wanted to give a little context about some of our cases, just because I think they inform the like advocacy work that we take on and do. And also just to give people an idea of how we can both like shape law through legal work and also like strengthen kind of gender equity throughout the state, and just kind of what that looks like using some of the tools that there are in the state, and to, you know, make sure people know that those exist. Um, Monica, do you want to talk a little bit about the Cooper case?
Sure. So we are working for trans inclusion in sports, and we sued USA Powerlifting with JC Cooper, who is an athlete who was barred from being a part of USA Powerlifting because she's trans. And so we're working with JC Cooper, and we sued, and we're currently right now waiting for the Minnesota Supreme Court to come down with the ruling on the lawsuit. And so we'll talk more about action steps that people can take just to support trans inclusion in sports, and also to some of the things we're thinking about just in preparation for this court case and for the ruling to come down.
I think one thing that's interesting about this case, also, I'll just say I haven't done a presentation in so long where I was the one sharing my screen, and it feels so weird to not be able to see people's faces. So yeah, please feel free to, oh, I figured out how I can. Okay, that's not like blocking anything. Great, this is much better. One thing about this case is we filed it, I think in 2019, so it was like a pretty long time before, maybe 2020. It was a pretty long time before there were, you know, trans inclusion in sports was such a topic of conversation with conservatives kind of across the board, and before like Trump had all the executive orders. And I think like you know, it, so to kind of see this case through now to this moment has been interesting, and just the like level at which it's been necessary for us to work to kind of explain to people why it's the fair thing to do to include trans women in sports. This next case is also around trans rights and inclusion. We're currently suing the Academy of Holy Angels and the Archdiocese of St. Paul in Minneapolis after they decided to not renew the contract of their much beloved throughout the school librarian after she came out. She's a secular employee. They knew she was not Catholic when she was hired. So we're trying to argue that the Minnesota Human Rights Act protects her from being effectively fired after coming out. So it's a little bit more complicated than some of our other cases, because the Human Rights Act like does have some religious exemptions included in it. But we're arguing that that was not the intention, was that those exemptions apply to secular employees. So like a Catholic school could decide not to hire a religious teacher if they like weren't Catholic or et cetera, et cetera. But we're arguing that that those shouldn't be applied to secular employees. And I think overall, we have taken some other religious exemption cases, and I think that the goal is to show that really often the use of these religious exemptions are explicitly to discriminate. We also have litigation in North Dakota, both challenging the gender affirming ban on minors as well as the abortion ban in the state, which is currently enjoined due to that lawsuit. So currently abortion is legal in North Dakota, but there's no providers because all the providers had to leave after the ban came. So that just kind of shows how like the law isn't enough. Monica, where is the gender affirming care ban case? Do you know what stage that's in right now?
I do.
Sure.
I think
It's
that
moving through.
it's just moving through, but it's slow. And so we're doing just work to build support for healthcare for trans youth, and but yeah, it's just moving through so far, slowly.
One thing one of the plaintiffs in that case said that's really stuck with me is he said it's almost worse having had access to care, and then if it gets taken away, like knowing how good that was and how important that was for my life, to have that then taken away was just more kind of increased the pain. So I'm yeah, it's been cool to get to work with people in North Dakota and work through the courts when the legislature is not is very, very conservative on the whole. And then just quickly, some of the like old cases that we've had, we challenged the abortion restrictions in Minnesota and won that case. So got rid of like decades of bad abortion legislation off of the we sued a pharmacy for not filling a prescription for emergency contraception, and that was another one where like the pharmacist's religious beliefs came into play, but it forced our client to like drive hours in a snowstorm with her like toddler in the car just to get her prescription filled. We've sued the DSC on behalf of a trans inmate, and also worked to secure victories for nursing parent at work. We've done some sexual harassment cases, healthcare coverage, and trans inclusion in schools. So those are some of the like issue areas that we take on kind of to like holistically fight for gender equity in Minnesota and North Dakota. So given kind of the state of okay, Monica, do you want to talk a little bit about like how we're thinking about legal work in relation to, because I think this kind of leads into these like action steps and questions for people to think about, like how the federal landscape kind of plays into our work.
Sure. Yeah, and also just so what we would love to hear from you all if you have questions or thoughts. So if you think about where we're at right now, we have the federal government, we have an administration that has really just taken, I think the first executive orders were about immigrants and also about trans people. And has really not said a lot about abortion and reproductive freedom. Um, and then has done just a bunch, right? It's just like so many every day something. But what I like to do is think about like what can we do so we don't get overwhelmed and then feel too just overwhelmed to act. And so the I think the thing that gives me hope around just Minnesota And the work we can do is thinking about like, how do we make it so that these attacks on our neighbors and on our family members and on just people, how do we make it so that in Minnesota we continue to just shore up our laws and to say like these are the laws and we support them, but I think more importantly to talk about what our values are and to talk about what the values we want to see in our communities, and in our state. And so around trans equity, you know, I think about, lawsuits, it's now in the hands of a small amount of decision makers on what happens with JC Cooper, or some of the other cases. But the piece that always is important is also just what our communities are doing and saying about the issues that are at hand. And um, so really around trans justice, we know that the attacks on trans people and the attacks on the humanity of trans people and the policies around the country, there's this year there's over in the last few years there's been hundreds and hundreds of anti-trans pieces of legislation. So, the legislation and then the federal rhetoric, I will say, because an executive order doesn't actually impact our laws, but that it really is about trying to dehumanize trans people and then also trying to basically take trans people out of public life. And so I feel like the best thing that we can be doing is making sure that we're building support. I always just think about like, how do we get more justice loving humans to act together? And so we have people who are like active and also speaking out, and then also doing it in a way where we know that the stereotyping and the dehumanization of trans people has really, I think, left a lot of people with, there can be people who have questions, who also, if people don't know trans people in their lives, they might just have like, I have a couple questions, I don't understand who I can ask. And so we really are just looking for the trusted people in our communities and across the state who are just going to talk with the people in their lives. It's a similar organizing model that we did around marriage equality. So, in the early 2000s, we had the majority of states who passed constitutional bans on the freedom to marry for same sex couples. And most of the states passed constitutional amendments that also banned domestic partnerships and civil unions. And at the time, I would say I think they want to get rid of us being able to get, like, in Minnesota, definitely you couldn't get fishing and hunting licenses as a family and whatever, but like just trying to take away any way where we could just be a family. And the way that we countered that was like not letting all of the anti like campaigns and policies um actually just like we didn't let it say like, oh, we're done. We just said, okay, how do we build more support? How do we get out there? And so that's what I feel like where we're at around trans equity. And then I just don't think we can sleep on still being vocal on our support for abortion and for reproductive freedom as well. So it's a narrative change game where we're, yeah, using the relationships in our lives to make sure that we have more supporters. So what do
Right
you
up.
think? Yeah, sorry.
No, you go ahead.
I was just gonna say, what are some of the gender equity issues? Do you have questions for us? Grace, you can talk.
I was just because you brought up narrative change, I was thinking I might jump to some of the polling that we have around media coverage and storytelling and narrative change. Because I think that's uh interesting and also illustrative of what you're talking about. So I'm just gonna very un smoothly get to those slides. But we can go back later. So there was this new polling that just came out from Periundum, which is a polling firm that we've worked with before, but this was nationwide. Um, And really interestingly, they talked to people in March, and then they talked to people in 2024, and then they talked to people again in December, right after the election in 2024, to see like what their like if their opinion had shifted, what like they'd seen, etc. Around abortion. Um, and they had a pretty big sample size, so 1,500 people, almost 1,600 people who did both waves of the research. And it over polled for Black adults, Latino adults, and AAPI adults. And I'm gonna go quickly to some of the key findings because I think they really they speak to the importance of like continuing to like talk about these issues with people, even when it's challenging. Yeah, this is the page that I wanted. So about 4 in 10 voters had a conversation about abortion around the time of the 2024 election. Data suggests these conversations reinforce abortion rights and access as a voting priority. Men who had conversations about abortion with the women in their lives were especially likely to prioritize abortion rights and access in their vote. Republicans and anti-abortion voters continue to deprioritize abortion in their voting. Data suggests the gap between Democrats and Republicans and priorities in the issue widened even more in 2024. And then this part, news stories about the impact of abortion bans broke through to many voters and likely shifted opinions. Voters who encountered stories about women facing ban-related harms are more likely than others to support abortion access throughout pregnancy, trust women to make decisions throughout a pregnancy, believe more restrictions are harmful, and prioritize voting, or prioritizing abortion in their vote. And then she also, did some, a lot of people just aren't seeing those stories because of the way that our news media is so, what's the word I'm looking for? Separate. People are in their like news lanes and not watching outside of their news lanes. And so what that reinforces to me is that like, okay, we can't, trust that good information is getting to people, and like who can we share those stories with. It's been sitting with me. I'll go back to sharing my screen in a second. But it's been sitting, I don't know if people have heard about this one, and I'm from Georgia, the story of the woman in Georgia who died. She's brain dead and she's being forced to continue her pregnancy on life support, and she's been on life support for 3 months and potentially has like 2 more months ahead of her, which is just so horrifying, and her family is in a really hard position because they don't have any choices. Yeah, so those kinds of stories, they really do make an impact on, and then people realize, oh, like maybe a 6-week ban, even with exceptions, there's gonna be gray areas in that the law can't predict. And shouldn't, isn't written by doctors or people who know what they're doing in pregnancy care. So I think like people are starting to like make those connections. And I'm gonna share my screen again, and I'm gonna pass it over to, oh yeah, Renee.
Well, I was just going to say, with 6 weeks, one of the things that surprised me when somebody said this is it's not 6 weeks from conception, it's 6 weeks from your last period. So it actually
Yeah.
could only be 4 weeks from conception. It's just a really arbitrary term period of time that doesn't really relate to the lives of women. And I never really understood it until I put it into that context, that it's not like somehow, like being based on anything other than a random number of when the first day of your last period started, which is,
So quick.
yes, so quick and so, you know, arbitrary, right?
Yeah. I've I was a little frustrated with some of the, I mean, maybe these were the ones the family chose, so that's like okay, but with some of the pictures of her that the media has used where she's been like very pregnant, she also has other kids. She was 9 weeks pregnant when she died. Um, And that's still in the window for like having a medication abort. She, she was, I think, it was she wanted to continue the pregnancy, but that's just so early.
Mhm.
Too. So yeah. Monica, do you want to talk a little bit about um some of the polling? I have some of the polling on the next slide too, but just the way that um in some ways in juxtaposition, like the media has been used to really do damage to um trans people and people seeing trans people as people, and how like that's shown up in like the ways that the administration has been able to, and states have like used that to pass horrible policy.
Yeah, I mean, it, it's relatively, I feel like it's relatively new where there have been just a concerted effort to target trans people for discrimination. And I think it was based on probably some polling that was done and trying to figure out ways that that people could use the lives of trans people to divide people. Um, and um, to me, I feel like I talked about this the last time when I joined you all, but the more telling, I think, so anyway, trans people have always been, I think that there's been a concerted effort to be like, these people should be discriminated against. So that's one thing. In Minnesota, though, we have such a strong history of supporting trans equality, of supporting trans inclusion. We were the first state to pass non-discrimination laws that were trans inclusive. So our Human Rights Act is still one of the strongest in the countries because we protect against discrimination in housing, employment, education, and public accommodations. And we passed it in 1993, the amendment that includes LGBTQ people, and the first state to include trans people. And so I always feel like when we're hearing all of these like stories on this, the misinformation and the fear mongering, I think as Minnesotans we can just say we've had since for a long time now, um, we have had trans inclusion in our non-discrimination law, and it has been great. And we don't have stories of whatever they're trying to say about why you shouldn't. And throughout as soon as we passed the Human Rights Act in what was it? Yeah, 1991, right? And that just sounds a long time ago. But as soon as we passed it, we were, um, we had to protect it, and there were, people wanted to just repeal it right away for many many years. But I'll say this: that we have the long history and track record of having this strong Human Rights Act, and then really the country was leaning more toward just inclusion and trying to figure out like how do we make sure that we're protecting everyone against discrimination. That's what we should be going for. And so much so that in 2016 when North Carolina passed a law that would have banned trans people from public accommodations like restrooms, that we had like the whole country kind of, there was many many states in our country who, and many organizations that boycotted North Carolina. And so it was, a time where really, like the NCAA and so many groups, um, just boycotted North Carolina. In Minnesota, there was state employees couldn't be using any state money to go to conferences or do any travel in North Carolina. Um, so I just think about it was just like 9 years ago that it's changed so much. And so that tells me is we can go back, and I feel like, Grace, I don't know if you want to move forward, but so in the last election, um, the campaign to elect Donald Trump spent millions of dollars. And I think one of the last ads that I think got the biggest amount of coverage was it was Kamala Harris is for they, them, and Donald Trump is for you. And then there's been like, just like talking about the next election, the midterm elections is also being about discriminating against trans people. I'll just say though that it was that it looks bad. So people were supporting trans equality, and I think all of the attacks on trans people has hurt some of the public support. And but also I think people are starting to really not like question why trans people are being so targeted, and also question and really just feel bad about how mean it is, how mean spirited. And so that's where I feel like there's the narrative change work, and just the like conversations with people we know will really help make make it so that this really terrible campaign to discriminate and erase trans people from public life that it ends. Because the way that we end it is that elected officials, campaigns know that it's a losing issue because people are mad at them for doing it, and also feel like this is not like that is not who I want to vote for. Somebody who is going to really launch a hateful campaign about any group of people, including trans people. And then, sorry, I need to say, when I said 1991, that's why I hesitated, because it was 1993. And I was like, wait, that was just, I worked on it when I just graduated from
Yeah, thank you, Renee, for fact
college.
checking
I
that.
know, I was like, wait a second, why that feels wrong. But yeah, so 1993. And and then uh and then we've also had trans inclusion in sports. Well, we have like a slide that shows I think a lot of our advances in Minnesota, but like we've had trans inclusion in sports at the Minnesota State High School League, that passed a policy in support of trans inclusion in sports in like 10 years ago, in 2015. And I think it still does damage, just all of the other states that are passing these laws. Grace, are you gonna just show some of the other? It's a terrible little map. It's a
Oh, that was
terrible.
in a different section of my slide deck, sorry.
Okay. Oh, no, no,
I'll
no.
go back and show it, yeah, but, I think the other thing, just kind of jumping off of what Monica said, that gives me a little bit of hope in that, from looking at that chart, that shows like losses of support, is that like lots more people now than 5 years ago, 10 years ago, etc., like personally know a trans person, and have trans people in their lives. And that also is, I think, a thing that really can move people. On just the like storytelling piece, just like some things to maybe spark like how to take action. I think it's gonna be really important in the coming months to uplift stories about the harms of discriminatory federal action, and just discrimination in our communities and in our state. Um, Consider telling a story that you have, um, or even just like, and when I say story, I mean that like very broadly. It can even just be like why you're supportive of whatever issue area you want to focus on. Um, it can be, respectfully about like someone you care about, or it can be, it can be like personal to you, but it can be broader than that. Share that with loved ones on social media, in a letter to the editor, to your local news outlet. All of those can make a big difference. Um, and then Monica talked a little bit about this, but like rooting your story, or perspective in some shared community value, can be really helpful. And like you can think about your audience a little bit with this one, but like, I think like one thing with abortion that sometimes like makes people think is like, you know, a value of bodily autonomy, or of like getting to make your own decisions, about your life and your body. So I think like thinking about what feels like authentic, what value feels authentic to you, and also like if that's a value like shared with the person that you're talking about to, can go a long way. And then we're always around if you want help kind of workshopping like how to share your story or who to share your story with. Yeah, Renee, that's a great question. Renee asked if it's okay to share the story of someone in your life from your own perspective. Like, I have a friend who had a hard time getting abortion care because they couldn't afford it, or like they were gonna have to drive 4 hours to go to a clinic. I think like, I don't know, with that kind of thing, like I think you just have to like use your own like discernment, like is it a story, like you could even ask the person, but like do you think it's like something they would be okay with you sharing, like is it, if not, like would they be identifiable in the story, who are you sharing the story with? Like I think that's one thing to like share something with like a friend versus like share something like publicly. So I think like asking those kinds of questions to yourself um can be helpful. I think it's like also easy to fall into the trap. I agree, yeah. Especially like personal information. And also like you probably have assumptions about their story that like aren't true. About like their motivations or feelings about what happened. Also don't want to fall into the trap of like the like my gay friend. Like I think that there's like ways to do it that are respectful, but yeah, definitely. You should take pause. Monica, do you have any? I feel like you're a good storyteller, so you've probably thought about this a little bit.
Yeah, I do think I think doing a little bit of workshopping around your personal story. Um, I I feel like your personal story can also be, it's not super dramatic, but you could say, I was at a meeting and we started just digging in about like why are there elected officials, campaigns, candidates who are targeting trans people for discrimination? And I had no clue that, over $200 million was spent on, electing our current president, that was on the backs of trans people and was about trans people and about stereotyping and promoting discrimination and hate. And whatever, like I like actually personalizing it even just to like how you're feeling and your own experience. um and then you can say things like, I just really believe people should just be able to be who they are. The body you're born with shouldn't determine who you get to be in life and who you're allowed to be in life. And that's a decision for what, like an individual to make, not the government, not an elected official, not anyone else. So, and just kind of come up with your hooks are around that. I also like to ask people to do something because then it's easier to ask people to join. So that's where you could be like, hey, and I signed on to this inclusion letter for trans people in sports through gender justice, and will you sign on with me? They can always say no, or they can have questions on.
Okay, I'm
Yeah.
gonna go back ungracefully again and show some of those maps that Monica was talking about and talk a little bit about the kind of state landscape. Do. Okay. Um, I find these quite hard to look at and like process and internalize, but this is from Guttmacher. They do research on reproductive health care in the US and also across the globe. And they kind of keep the most up-to-date track of statewide policies. So this is kind of an abortion access map throughout the country. So you can see Minnesota is surrounded by states with some pretty bad laws. So a lot of people are coming here for care. Not just from the Midwest, from all over the country, but I think what we're seeing is like the total number of abortions are it has not really shifted much in the past couple of years, but people having abortions in states with protective laws is much higher, and in states with restrictive laws is much lower. So it's shifting like who is able to access abortion care. And of course where they're getting that care. This is from Erin in the Morning. She's an independent journalist who focuses on trans rights issues. And again, you can see, just a very divided country. I think, like, to just thinking about people's, how they're having to set up their lives. Her recommendation is, for trans people not to travel to Texas or Florida. So I think, what we're seeing in Minnesota is huge kind of waves of people deciding to move here for their kids or for themselves, to get away from some of those worst laws. I talked to families from Texas and Missouri, and hi Sean, thanks for being here. So I think, and a lot of those people are moving to the cities, but not all of them are, especially as some of the other areas in Minnesota are more affordable. So it just feels like more important than ever to make our communities safe for people who are traveling here and moving here. Yeah, Monica, do you want to take this question?
Sure. I mean, so both for trans adults and then trans youth, you can even look at it's even like more red in the like high risk and danger and worse laws passed. So so I mean the discrimination kind of, I just feel like it knows no bounds in some ways, but it's basically just again trying to figure out every way to erase trans people from public life. And the thought behind it is I think it's being pushed by extreme right groups who are really just trying to think about like how do we stop trans people from being in existence and not and so thinking about like for trans people it's like they're like, well, we want to make sure you can't have any kind of gender markers that are actually the gender of who you are. So that would be birth certificates, driver's licenses. The federal government instantly just stopped access to passports. And I'm not giving the legal, so if people are really looking for like the like what is legally possible, we just encourage you to look at our website and also contact us about that. But I just think that it's just really the sentiment behind it is like, and it's been from the extreme right groups anyways, that they really think that LGBTQ people shouldn't exist. And so the whole thought is like, well, if we can make it really difficult and there's discrimination, then LGBTQ people won't exist. And there can be conversion therapy and we can really eradicate LGBTQ people then. So anyway, so by making it so that, you just go to conversion therapy and you're no longer trans or LGBT, Q. So the laws are horrible. So it's looking at access to gender markers that actually are about the gender you are, making sure that there's not non-discrimination laws that protect you from being discriminated against in places like in Minnesota that you're protected, like employment, housing, education, public accommodations. And then it's actually like discriminating against people who are seeking healthcare and trying to make it so that also just the same with abortion, but that doctors who would give you the health care you need for gender affirming care, that then they could also be criminally charged, or they could face some really steep penalties and fines. And so that's all of the different kinds of laws that we're seeing. And um, and there's a lot of lawsuits out there trying to stop them, trying to prevent them from being enacted. And we're winning some of those lawsuits across the state. across the country. But I will just say, like, it's been the worst. It's just really been the worst for trans people as far as having to face so much uncertainty, so much discrimination, and again, just attacks on just their humanity. And um and so just put a finer point on it for the youth part. So the Trevor Project does a survey every year, and um they ask, just youth. It's not every year, it's like every couple of years, but they do surveys, and they ask youth um how they're doing. It's both about like how they're feeling, what their life is like, what's their school like, you name it. And the survey that was last taken from last year said 90% of the youth said that they they're negatively impacted by legislation that's out there in our states, and by politics in general across the country. And that's not surprising. Um, but the other thing they said was that 88% said, when asked like what can people do to support you, what can people do to help make it better, and 88% said just trusting who I am. That's what they're asking for. And 81% said standing up for me. And so for me, that's just like our charge. Like that's what we have to do. Um, and like I said, in Minnesota, it's a different story than it is in North Dakota. But in North Dakota, we've got the lawsuit, and there's also a lot of people who are working to make it so that trans people are not discriminated against. And so I just really feel like, it's a really really heartbreaking map to look at, but we have to keep fighting for the world we want and that we know we can get. And I'm just going to quick read. Uh, it really is the anti-trans discrimination. So Sean put some in the chat, but the anti-trans discrimination is like I said, I think there's been some polling done about how do you divide people. There's also, it's part of the white Christian nationalist worldview and trying to propagate that. And it includes having really strict gender binaries. And it also includes, just uh, an agenda of a world. Um, yeah, that is terrifying, but also just really trying to essentialize gender. And so the attacks against trans people um, are, I think, part of why that it's so popular right now, but also just the fact that also it's a way to keep also pushing for um, getting rid of, like there were definitely a number of the far right actors who said they started with getting rid of um like the it was like the DEI, it was the early starts of getting rid of diversity and inclusion, and really the same people who started making a big deal out of critical race theory and trying to stop any kind of talk about racism in the United States and saying that that's anti-American. So they started some of the same architects of that kind of narrative, and that was successful. Then they went into trans people. So it was a plan, and yeah, that's part of what we're up against right now.
It's a good transition. I won't spend too much time on this, but just on the what are we up against, I think one thing that this administration has been scarily good at is reliance on and sponsoring junk science. So there was a report recently that came out that was super long about gender affirming care for kids, that basically concluded in and I read it. I think some people say that this is like an overstatement, but no, it really did end in like we need to stop care and go to conversion therapy practices. And then there was another report around mifepristone, which is the first step in most medication abortions. misrepresenting data around, its safety. It's very safe. It's safer than Tylenol. Threats. Okay, I'm gonna get to the more hopeful stuff soon. There's also, up against threats to Medicaid funding and other federal budget cuts. But I think one thing that we really want to hammer home. Yes, Renee, there have been, Monica, you are more of an expert in this, but yes, conversion therapy is harmful. It's very harmful.
It is, and a lot of states were starting to ban conversion therapy, and so I feel like even even the report that by the administration about healthcare for trans people, I think that everyone's a little leery to say conversion therapy. They're just like, you need to get therapy to change who you are, but we're not calling it that. But yeah, it's really harmful. Every major psychological professional institution has come out against it, and Minnesota, we banned it. But it's really harmful. And again, it's not saying you should be who you are and let's support you, and then also figure out how to make this world a place where you can just be who you are. No, it's like, no, there's something wrong with you for being who you are, and so we definitely want to change it. So it's
I
a
think,
it's terrible.
yeah, the thing that the report did that was so, one of the things that it did that was so grotesque is it's like, it's like, this isn't, we're not saying conversion therapy, we're not saying conversion therapy, and then they say, well, being gay got taken out of the DSM-5. So we're not pathologizing that anymore, but gender dysphoria like still is in the DSM. So then the solution is therapy. So there's really this like pathologizing of trans people and trans identity. That's really dangerous. And it gets complicated because, that's oh, sorry, I didn't mean to stop sharing my screen. It's important too that trans people are able to access healthcare, and some of, on the legal side, that's like how some of that is, like, how we've set it up, but I think we've just set it up poorly, where then what you end up with is conservatives saying horrible things that kind of deny trans people their identity and their humanity. I just wanted to reiterate, as we're tasking you all with being like messengers of good, accurate information. That the Minnesota Human Rights Act and Minnesota State Constitution include strong protections for people seeking abortion care and for LGBTQ people. Abortion and gender affirming care remain legal in Minnesota. All private and public health plans must include abortion and gender affirming care. And our state attorney general has preemptively sued the Trump administration over his threats over trans inclusion in sports. And oh, I didn't finish the sentence, and continues to sue the administration on, I think, the AG has like 30 cases or something right now against the Trump administration. So there's like people fighting for Minnesotans. And there's lots of people fighting in red states and doing great work too, but we really do have a strong advocate in our attorney general. Back to the hard stuff, access still remains a pretty big barrier to abortion access. These are all of the abortion clinics in Minnesota. There's just 8 of them. And the ones I have highlighted only provide medication abortion. And Just the Pill is just a virtual clinic. There's actually a couple other virtual providers that people can get a medication abortion through. But you can see it's pretty concentrated in the Twin Cities, and leaves a lot of the state, hours away from care. So I think when we're like thinking about, helping people in our own communities, I'm not sure where, I think some of you shared where you live. I think like just kind of thinking through like, okay, if I had a neighbor or if a friend in my life like needed abortion care, like how could I support that, and like where are actually the places where they can go and how can I help them get there? Because a lot of the support that's needed right now is like, the laws are good, and then how can we like practically support people that so they can actually make it to their appointments? Another kind of a campaign that like gender justice cares a lot about, and I think like, I mean, it's a problem all over the state. You can see there's like 98 of them about in the state. But another like real barrier to people getting quick, real care are crisis pregnancy centers. And those are like there's kind of a range of what they do, and some of them are more sinister in their tactics than others, but they try to get people in the door, many of under kind of sometimes the auspices that they could receive an abortion there, or that they could receive any real medical care there. They sometimes have ultrasound machines, but they're not diagnostic ultrasounds. They're just like, what's the word? Like souvenir ultrasound. So there's been problems with people like having missed ectopic pregnancies. They have deceptive practices around like what they do, and often spread misinformation about STIs, birth control, abortion care, and other healthcare. They often don't have medical providers on staff or in the building. They really are all throughout the state. I included a link, Monica, maybe you can put it in the chat, to look up where the closest pregnancy centers are to you. They also like, some of them do provide like real support for parents, like diapers or car seats, or parenting classes, but they often tie those to Christian like teachings, or like we'll say like, okay, well, you can have a token to go to the like baby clothes little area that we have if you take a religious parenting class. So the Attorney General also put out a consumer alert around these centers, just like making sure people know like what they are and what their agenda is. We have on Unrestricted, we have a guide to kind of just show people quickly kind of like how to spot them, what they are, how to find legitimate clinics, and like where to go if having to. I think it's hard because there are areas in Minnesota where like some of the resources that crisis pregnancy centers provide aren't readily available in the community. And so I think that the kind of what I want to like task people with as they're thinking about like organizing locally and supporting your local community is like, how can I help fill that gap? So people don't have to feel like they have to go to these places that do not have their best interest in mind and really are solely focused on advancing an anti-abortion agenda. I'll add one other thing that they do is that a lot of them are connected to like big multinational anti-abortion organizations. And so they all use the same database, and they're collecting people's health information. Because they're not real health clinics, they don't have to abide by HIPAA, they're under no obligation. So they have really shoddy data practices too. Yeah. Yeah, that sounds great, Renee. I'll just go quickly. Yeah, how to take action on some of these like federal and state landscape questions. Learn the resources in your community. You can also support or volunteer your local abortion fund or practical support group. So those are people that organizations that like directly fund people's abortions. But then there's also groups that like make sure people can like get a ride to their appointment or like have childcare, that kind of thing. Become a volunteer clinic escort. Share the AG consumer report. Or there's also some groups that do direct actions against crisis pregnancy centers. I only know about ones in the Twin Cities. But you can think about, or just like how to educate people about what the CPC in your community is doing and who they are. And then Monica talked a lot about this, but push back against hate and misinformation that you hear in your community. And you can find some resources for talking about trans equity, gender-based discrimination, abortion access, and more on the Gender Justice Unrestricted Minnesota website. We also have some, and we're gonna have some more soon, like some like know your rights resources and like sample advocacy letters if like, you know, a trans kid who's like facing problems with inclusion at schools, like we have like letters where it lists out all of the, case law and all of that to give to schools to be a little bit of a push of, if you do this, you'll get sued. Cool. Okay, well, I will wrap. That feels like a good place to end. Monica, do you have any like last thoughts to share, especially like on people can take action in their communities?
We would love to hear your questions. Yeah, we would love to hear your questions, and then we can always wrap with a couple ideas about actions.
That sounds great. Thank you so much for all the information. I think it's a topic that is we could talk about endlessly, right? There's so much there. So folks, if you want to, we'll just stay in this room. I'm going to turn off the recording, however, so we can have a conversation without having to have the rest of the world talk about it.